Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This week we're doing another Christmas card in the Watercolor Christmas card series. And this week we are going to learn how to do a holiday botanical collection. And it's going to cover snowberries and cedar, pine, and holly. So if you're interested in learning how to do some quick watercolor illustrations of these holiday botanicals, then keep on watching. I'm starting out by making a very simple stick drawing for each of my botanicals. I'm going to start with snowberry, and then I'll do cedar, and then move along to pine, and finally holly. So I'm not actually drawing leaves, I'm just sort of drawing the main stem and lines out for where I'll place leaves. And this just gives me a little bit of a guide rather than painting right onto blank paper. So I'm starting with the snowberry painting, and I'm just making a line down the center for the stem, and then I'm lightly painting in some lines on the side for branches, and I'm using my number 4 round brush for this, and this is a nice fine pointed brush. If you don't have a really fine point, you could use a smaller size brush if that works better. Now I'm starting with the leaves, and I'm just using a darker green and a lighter green, and I'm using the tip and the shape of my brush just to press down and make that leaf shape. And I'm making sure that I paint some darker leaves and then dip my brush in clean water, dab it on a paper towel, so some of the paint is washed out and I get that more faded green color as well. And this is really going to help your painting come to life and add contrast and interest. Now I'm starting to paint the berries. I'm using a mix of light red and ultramarine to create a pale gray color that has a little bit of a blue tone to it still. And I'm just creating a circle and leaving a little spot of white paper showing through for the highlight. And I've switched to a smaller number 1 brush for this, and I'm just going along and placing the berries in where I think the space kind of needs to be filled, and I'm painting them in little clusters. And I'm just painting them wet on dry because it's such a small area. And having one last look at the snowberry, I decided to add in one extra branch to fill in the space and even out the composition. So I just added in a stem and then painted a few more leaves on there. And then I just added the little brown bits to the berries as the dried up sepals to finish off the snowberry. Now I'm moving on to the cedar. And again, I'm starting with drawing the center line, just a single line. And then I'm using 2 colors of green again. I made a darker green using some perylene green. And I'm making sure my paint mix is nice and watery. Now I'm just stippling around with my brush to indicate the scales of the cedar, which is kind of like a lace look, and some people think they look like little fish scales all placed together. And I'm doing a sort of interpretive representation of this. So I'm just leaving lots of little white spaces showing through, and then adding the darker paint and stippling it together and letting the paint run together and making little points off the ends to indicate the tips of the cedar scales. And again, I'm doing the same trick for my leaves. I'm using some dark paint, and then I'm also rinsing my brush or just dipping it once in clean water, dabbing it on the paper towel, and then painting onto the paper to create that paler color. And I really love how the darker color and the paler colors are running together. And then I'm just moving my way down, creating little segments. So there's the center segment on the end, and now I'm creating segments on each side. And I'll move down to the bottom of the stem doing the same technique. Now I'm starting on the pine, and again I'm using my number 4 brush to create the center stem and then the 2 secondary stems off the sides. Then I'm going to use my same dark and light mix of greens, and with my brush really upright so I get a nice fine line, I'm just creating little wispy lines coming off the center stem to represent the needles. And pine needles are longer than fir and spruce needles, so you want these ones to be fairly long and wispy, all sort of growing in a conical arrangement and overlapping each other. And you can experiment if pulling up away from you or down works better. I just turned my paper upside down because I find pulling down towards me I get a bit of a thinner, finer stroke. And I'm just going along, overlapping, changing from the light green to the dark green to create all the pine needles. Now I'm taking the brown, which is Payne's Gray and Burnt Sienna, and I just sort of made a bit of a thicker stem at the bottom of the pine. Now we're moving on to the holly, and I'm using a darker green, Pearline green, and I made the basic leaf shape. And while that's still wet, I'm quickly pulling off sort of pointed lobes off the side of the holly leaf. And this is a way that you can use the one-stroke painting method that I use to create a leaf like the holly leaf, which is more of a complex shape. So once again, I'm just creating that basic leaf shape, and now with the flick of my brush using the tip, pressing down and then lifting up to create the fine point, I'm creating the pointed lobes of the holly leaf. And I made sure this leaf is darker than the first one I painted, so always using that technique to create dark and light contrast. And this is a really fun way to create really quick leaves. And you can also, if you're confident that the paper is still wet, you can dab in a little bit of extra color to create more variation. Now I've dipped my brush in clear water, dabbed it on the paper towel, and have a much lighter leaf that I'm painting here with the same method. And then I've dabbed in a bit of darker color so that spreads around while I'm painting. And so the trick to this is just making sure that your paint is wet enough so that you can have everything run together and stay wet to create this sort of one-stroke technique. So if your paint's drying up and you're getting lines and it's not blending, then try it again with a little bit wetter paint on your palette. Now I am jumping right into the berries. You can dry the holly leaves if you'd like, or you can just sort of paint the berries right in and they'll blend a little bit, which I think is fine too. I'm continuing on painting the berries, and just like the leaves, I'm using some darker red and then some lighter red. And I also am making sure that I dilute my brush so that I get the washed out color effect on some of the berries as well. And I'm just using my smaller #1 brush, creating a circle and leaving a little highlight of blank paper showing through, just like I did with the snowberries. And I'm just going along adding more berries until I feel like I have a balanced look to this little bunch of holly. So I'll add a few more in and then I'll be finished. Now I'm just lightly adding in a few veins to the holly leaves. So I'm just lightly creating a center vein and then just some wisps off the side for the indication of a few secondary veins. And this just gives a little bit more shape and dimension to the leaves. You can leave them blank if you'd like, but I just like adding that little extra touch. Now I decided to add just a little bit more definition to my holly leaves, so I'm going with my #1 brush in a darker green, which is a concentrated mix of perylene green, and just adding a little V of dark color where the little corners around the lobes are. And you can just draw them on with damp paint, wet on dry, and then you can rinse your brush and blend them a little bit if you'd like. If you want to blend them, I would suggest painting on the paint, rinsing your brush and blending each one as you go. Sometimes I paint a few and blend them, but I'm fairly confident with my paint dry times and consistency. So if you're a beginner, I'd just do one at a time. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it and subscribe to my channel for a new video every Wednesday. And if you're interested in learning more about watercolor painting and botanicals, then do visit my website for more information on my online school for full-length classes. And you can find the information at lauraashton.ca. See you next week.